Okay, I'm Ernie Nagamatsu. I'm from Los Angeles, California, and we're here at the Chantilly Arts and Elegance Concours of Rollout event, a spectacular event. And from last year, Patrick Peter had invited me via email because he felt the Old Yeller was significant in many ways. Number one, that it hasn't been restored, and he knew all about the car from racing at Goodwood. And in addition to that, it represented American racing somehow. And it certainly did, because it was a home-built special that raced against all the factory team cars from 1959-1960 period, which was really the high water mark of sports car racing and the biggest purses that brought all the factory team cars from Europe to challenge anything that America had. And America didn't have a lot. They had the Scarab, but then Max was a hot rodder, and so he made it whatever was the best fit together. And so because he did that, he started out in 1932 with a 1932 Ford Roadster, and it was called the Buford Special, and he had a Buick motor put in, and he went to Pebble Beach in 1952 to compete against the very best with Ferraris and Jaguars. Whatever they had, he took his hot rod. They almost banned him, but he learned that he could be the fastest to the corner and nobody could beat him, and that was actually true. But he certainly didn't have the brakes, and he didn't have a lower CG, and that CG was a difficult problem with the 32 Roadster. So with people like Ken Miles that he befriended that had the shingle at that time, and after, he was a great mentor. Max didn't have a lot of mentors, he felt, but other than Winfield and a few other people, but he really respected Ken Miles. Ken Miles took a shingle, took a MG Special, lowered it, did all the little tricks, and from that, Max learned that maybe he could use bigger motors and bigger chassis, longer chassis, and so he started experimenting. So he went from that to a Doretti, and Doretti, made by the Swallow Company, they sent a few over, called it the Doretti, and Max stuffed a Buick in right away. And his idea was to really sell the Dorettis with a Buick, but that didn't go over too well. He raced about 3 or 4 races with the Doretti, but he found that the wheelbase was too short. And just like a Pantera and other cars, a Cheetah, it could get very vicious if it's too short wheelbase with high torque, big power motor. So he learned a few lessons from that. Then Dick Morganson had the Old Yeller 1, but it wasn't called the Old Yeller 1. It was Morganson Special. And the Morganson Special had a tragic accident in Torrey Pines. And what had happened, it was a ladies' race, and the lady lost control. And I think Dick Morganson was a little touched by that and set him back. But Max said, well, he'll take care of the car, and maybe he'll sell the car for Dick. But in the meantime, Max is not a great salesman, but actually he was quite cagey. He knew the Morganson Special had special tricks. Number one, it was an ugly car. Maybe he got that trick too. But it was lowered, and the CG was very low with a Plymouth motor, and it showed that with American horsepower and lightweight tube chassis, you can go quite fast as long as you develop the brakes. And Max converted to drum brakes made by Buick, because all the hot rodders learned they had the best brakes. So he started learning the tricks from Ken Miles. That meant all the specials had Morris Minor steering racks and Morris Minor torsion bars and Jaguar transmissions, and certainly you had protector goggle and certain helmets. But part of that Max thought was important was really the technical part. And he was like Phil Hill and a few others that not only tinkered with car, but Max he understood everything other than aerodynamics. And so working with Buicks, he always had the problem with overheating. And he developed the Morganson Special, and I think the turning point, he started having wins with the Morganson Special, now called the Old Yeller 1. And that's where the name came for Old Yeller 1. But he modified it by putting in a Buick motor and Buick bits and other things. But then he realized that he's really at the top of his game within the top 10 qualifying every time without a doubt. And he became legendary for this ugly truck-fendered Morgan's and Special, aka Old Yeller 1. And finally he and Eric Hauser, who was sort of a quasi partner, somehow they shared driving and they had a dispute. And Max says, well, let's split the car. So you take the car, I'll take the motor. And I don't know how that deal came about, but Max understood that there wasn't anything that he couldn't fabricate, but the motor is kind of special to him because he was a guru for Buicks. He even did Buick motors for speedboats, so he was a go-to guy. So he took chalk lines at Hollywood Motors in Hollywood, California, laid it out with Ina. He sat on a milk carton box holding a steering wheel, and Ina laid out some lines, and they figured what would be the ideal length, overall length, what should be the track, what should be the weight, maybe certainly the one thing that was a sure thing before they started the project, they had to have a Buick motor. Why a Buick? Was it cheaper? Yeah, a little bit cheaper, but the secret was it had low-end torque that he could outrun anybody from street racing. So in sports car racing, there wasn't like single-purpose tracks like Riverside at that time, and other tracks that became quite famous for just being a race track. But there were March Air Force Base, and there was Santa Barbara was an airport where he did very well. But those were airports, and so it was like a drag race to the corner. You turn, brake, and back, and so depending on the corner, and so you had to work on those tricks. But he knew that if he can get to the corner fast, then he'll have a little extra time to get around, developing the brakes and the handling. And so with that in mind, I think the turning point came when in 1958 Lance Raventlow at Santa Barbara broke the overall track record at Santa Barbara with a Scarab. And within 3 months at the next race, Max, with the Old Yeller 1, as scruffy as it was, he broke the track record, and he said, if I can break the track record in this car, I can build one. And so Eric Hauser and Max parted their ways, and with the building, and Ina also welded, and that's a known fact. They had parts from the shelves from all these different cars, not a problem, Morris Minor bits and pieces. And so they figured out everything that could work. Hot rod trick, they moved the motor back. Hot rod trick, safety feature. Hot rod track racing, they had a Nerf bar that was outside the door of the 32s mainly. And Max incorporated that in the chrome moly tube chassis to come around the driver by that much. In a Lotus Chapman, you were right next to the aluminum body. You had no leeway in case you were T-boned. And the other safety feature is he took a Jag upper A-arm 120 in the front and a Pontiac lower A-arm shortened, and he drilled holes in that because he remembered Vukovic and everybody else from Indy, because before 1959 or 58 period, in an Indy car, if you smacked the wall, it was adios. It was no way to survive. There was no absorbing. And true to form and Max's perception to technology and safety is that one time at Riverside, he did hit the corner, hit the armacle, and the reporters came up and says, wow, you got that fixed really quick. He says, I have spare upper A-arms. But I said, these holes were drilled for crushability. I just disconnected. I put on a new A, went out, finished the race, and not a problem. So those are the safety features that he incorporated in the design of his tube chassis. He said to me over and over before I even got the car, you could twist that car tons, and that chassis will never bend and flex like the bird cage that would crumple up like pasta sticks. And so he was, and Ken Miles again, he differed in a few areas about having a loose suspension because he and Ken Miles consulted a lot. But he tried every carburetor. He tried Strombergs, which are on now, but he tried even Hilborns and Webers. And so he was the only one that had a durometer, and he would pull out recaps out of cure 5 minutes and 4 minutes, testing for softness. He was the first one to have a durometer, and everybody was going hard tires for Riverside and Elkhart, and he was going soft, and he was checking every tire, and they were using Continentals and Dunlops, hard as rock. They didn't want to blow out. Max is going soft. And he finally saw that GM was recalling station wagon white walls. And he found out about it. He checked it. Sure enough, they were throwing treads. It was too soft. He had all his friends, and they had a stacks of white wall tires. So whenever Dan and Carol, whenever they raced, they always had white walls. It was not to play the joker and the scam man by coming with white walls like gangster tires, but it was the fact that they wanted the softest race tires they could find. And so this car, the original parts of it that are really important to me, I had all the history, the trophies, I had all the lap charts by Ina. I had everything. I was friends with Ina, I'd hang out with him. Before I even got the car, sometimes people at an auction pay big money, get a car, then there's a lot of missing parts, and there's mystery, and they have to search it. I had everything about this car. Like this door, for instance, never fit right, but that's the way it is. This mechanism, I think Max made, it's still his. These are some dash plaques. Here's a P-51 Mustang cover. He always liked it. You flipped up, turned, sealed tight. Everything had to work. And Zeus fasteners, he did, because ugly, but you could take everything off in 8 minutes, he said. 8 minutes I can get to any part of this car. Then in 1959 he built the car, but it had teething problems. Sorry for the pun, being a dentist. But anyway, he struggled, things broke and cracked and everything for the first 3 races. And then he caught his stride. But by then, it was the fastest car. It would always be out there in the front 3 or 2. And so everybody, like Hollywood being Hollywood, like having actors and actresses waiting for the part, they came to Hollywood Motors just kind of begging, salivating, trying to get a ride with this car. And so you see the names here. Not only Max drove it, but Carroll Shelby, Dan Gurney, Bob Bondurant, Bill Krause, Bobby Drake, and Paul O'Shea. At Riverside, Max saw Dan and said, "Dan, you're back from Europe. What are you doing?" "Well, I wanted to race something, but don't have a ride." Max said, "Look, Dan, get in the car, take it down the road. If you like it, drive it in the Grand Prix." So it was a sports car Grand Prix. And here Max is giving the seat to Dan Gurney. He knew that maybe he could build more cars. He was quite a crafty guy. So if I could get some of these guys to give a ad page, so to speak, in Sports Car Magazine that this car is great, well, they loved it. Dan Gurney always has a famous quote after he raced his car. It's like racing a baby buggy. It was so easy. So Dan raced it twice. He raced it at Riverside, and he raced it at Laguna Seca. And Carroll Shelby raced it. He raced it at Elkhart, and it was the biggest purse. He outran all the factory team cars by 51 seconds. Everybody was there. Scarab, the Listers, Testarossas, Birdcage. The Birdcage from Le Mans was there. All the Porsches and D-Jags, everything else. And Billy Krause with a D-Jag special. Everybody was there, and he ran away 51 seconds. There he said, maybe there's some magic to that. American big block, lightweight chassis, that gets you to the front. So he thought about that. Maybe the side story and backstory to that is that Pete Brock, the great designer of the Cobra Daytona, he worked for Max for 1.5 years, and they got together, and the Brock and Carroll Shelby team is legendary. The rest is history. But a little bit of the genealogy, DNA maybe, some of the thought processes of just do it, get it done, was maybe from Max in the shop in Hollywood Motors. So that's a sidebar to that. And then Bob Bondurant raced it at Vacaville, and he speaks fondly about Max, saying, take the car, let's go to Vacaville. They drive all night, they put tape on the headlights, and Max says, listen, just one thing. You stay in fourth gear and forget the other guys. You will catch them at the first turn. And so they're coming around on a rolling start. He stays in fourth gear, and boom, he was right. By the time they got to the first turn, Old Yeller's in the front of everybody because it's a torque of the motor. And one race, I think he lost the lower gears. He ran in fourth, locked into fourth gear, but he still did very well because of the torque at the low end, and you can use it for high end in the taller gears. And then he raced it at Vacaville. Billy Krause raced it at Pomona. And Billy Krause, as you know, is the first Cobra driver for Carroll Shelby. And he says in one magazine article, he said, they asked him what's the best car. He raced everything and Can-Am cars. What was the best car? He says, no doubt, the Old Yeller was the greatest car to race. So whether it was maybe a combination of comfort or safety or performance. Bobby Drake was a noted driver in Southern California. He was one of the first birdcage drivers. They sent him to Italy to test the birdcage. He came back. He went half a year. There was a dispute, so he was no longer the birdcage driver. So he was a good friend of Max. So Max had him drive a couple races, and he won a couple races for Max. And Paul O'Shea, he won the last race in 1960 at Las Vegas. Paul O'Shea was a famous national SCCA champion with the Gullwing Mercedes, if you can imagine. And of course, he did some songs and singing. If you have the LP, he did one LP of songs. And so I think because I knew Max and Ina, and I remember when Ina was very sick with cancer, and years after racing, they never went to a track, and it's like they walked and shut the door. And only when I started racing Formula Fords, Max started coming out, and Ina was very sick, I remember, and she came out with Max with sandwiches, and I was racing a Formula Ford, and she brought out her stopwatch. She was the one that decided some races in the early races. She had all the lap charts going on other cars in the top 3 or 4. And so one time she settled a dispute, but to have Ina at the track at Willow Springs with a stopwatch in her hand after having left for years and having been a big part of this car. So when I got the car, I think more than not to be elitist or anything, it's almost I was bestowed with the treasure and history, but also I was given somewhat of a responsibility. And I always tell people when I speak or say anything that we're only custodians of things, whether it's an Oscar, whether it's a Alfa Bugatti or a race car, Can-Am, Lister, whatever it might be, we're only custodians for a period of time. And I feel like in my case, I think everything talks more to me maybe than the next person, because like you see that addition in the fender, and it's a strip that's been riveted. It's when they went from narrow rims to wider rims. Well, they had to make a bigger fender. Do you make a new fender, or you just tack rivet another section? And so I think if all those things like that, and the door and the dash plaques and the P51, they all talk to me differently than I think other cars I race. I race a Cobra and a Speedster, but this kind of talks to me. And it's sort of a responsibility to share the story like Elaine and I do. We bring 500 to 1,000 cards. We give out cards, pins, and badges. It's not that we're trying to promote this car. It's sort of a sense of what we've been given sometimes, whether it's a piano stool, a sheet of music. If you're into music, say, here, take this and guard this with your life. And so we guard this with our life in our own way by racing internationally. And this car is so respected internationally that it just makes us even more inspired and energized to share more. We went to, one last comment, we went to Phillip Island. They wanted the car for the 25th anniversary, tribute to Sir Jack Brabham. And 525 cars in Australia, the biggest race. And a fan comes running up and he says, look at my ticket. Here's a picture of the Old Yeller, one American car on a race in Australia. It reminds us the legacy and responsibility. So, steward, yes, responsibility huge. And I can hear him talking.
Perfect. That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Wow.
People might wonder, is Sterling Moss connected to this car? Yes, in a sense, indirectly, and maybe through the legal files. But Max was kind of a great guy to share this car. He would say, take it down the street, check it out, let me know what you think. And so at Pomona, Sterling Moss was there, and Max said, hey, take the Old Yeller, take it out and come back and let me know what you think. And so Sterling Moss got in the car, went out. He had no ID, no money from England. And sure enough, the cops pull him over. Here's an odd looking car. They take him to the jail. They want to keep him. They kept him overnight in jail. He had no ID, didn't know who to call. Finally, they found him and the next morning and got him out. And so he fondly always talks about that story because he says, well, it wasn't so bad because when I got to England, they paid me a couple quid for that story about being thrown in jail driving a yellow car.